everyone, and welcome to the Byolete podcast, the podcast where we discuss the science behind the brand. In this episode, we're going to be discussing insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is arguably the underlying cause for many long-term chronic health conditions, and so it's a very important one this week. So let's get into it. So it's my turn this week to ask you the question. Random question, but it's related to the topic that we're going to speak about today. So I was having a little Google thinking about what I could ask you, and this one popped up. So can you name an animal that uses insulin resistance to its benefit?
I think I was just going to say a bear, purely because when I've been reading, we used insulin resistance as an evolutionary type of thing. So a bear, where they're going into hibernation, they need to conserve energy in different ways. So that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, that was correct. To be honest, I wasn't sure whether you were going to get that because I probably would never have got it. But yeah, very well done. And it's probably a good one for if you ever go into a pub quiz, you might get that asked. Very random niche knowledge to know, but I love stuff like that. So yeah, insulin resistance is obviously the topic we're discussing this week. We're just going to go a very brief overview again, like we have done in the previous podcasts. We will go into deeper contexts of insulin resistance in terms of how it affects sleep, how diet's affected by it, how exercise is affected by it. But this week, like say, it's just going to be, what it is, and a bit of the pathophysiology of it.
Okay.
So should we start off by just sort of saying or discussing what is insulin resistance?
Yeah, so insulin resistance is merely a lack of the ability of the body to recognize insulin and its effects.
Mm-hmm.
That's basically it, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a lot more complex than that.
Mm-hmm.
We've looked into what insulin does, and I think it's a good idea to say what insulin does, and then you can recognize what the body's not doing in response to insulin.
Yeah.
So I'll name one, you name one, and let's see where we get up to. So one of the effects of insulin inherently is to initiate the uptake of glucose into cells.
Yes. It also causes the storage of fat, or like the transmission of fat from the plasma into the cell.
Yeah, and then
Storage.
the main other one that you can think of is to inhibit gluconeogenesis, so the formation of new glucose within the liver.
Yeah.
But all the effects of insulin basically are anabolic.
Yeah.
Which is why anyone who's type 1 generally are diagnosed because of lack of weight, thirst, hunger, etc. But it's mainly involved in, it's famous for its effects in glucose and carbohydrate metabolism.
Mm-hmm.
But I looked at something before, and they estimate how many people do you think in the US are classed as insulin resistant, or the estimated value?
I'm going to say 100 million. Was that right?
1 and 2, they reckon. So what is it, 340 million in the US?
Okay.
So about 170 million.
Wow.
Which is a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot. And it is important because I think, like we said at the very beginning of this podcast, it's probably the underlying cause for a lot of other health conditions that we talk about on this podcast, especially. So like heart disease, high blood pressure, obviously obesity, even though they're all interlinked and one can precede the other. But, insulin resistance is probably the one that does underline it all.
Well, the more I've looked into it, the more I see how central insulin is towards everything in the body. So it does increase cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, dementia. Then you've got cancers. There's studies on giving insulin to people who've got mouse models that have got cancers anyway, and watching them progress. But yeah, it is definitely the underlying cause of a lot of diseases and conditions. But I think the term's diluted so much, I don't think a lot of people understand, because I didn't really until I looked into what it fully meant.
Yeah, I know. Did you want to go more into what it does fully mean? So, what actually happens when you do get insulin resistance, and why it would be maybe hard for someone who is insulin resistant to revert back because of the mechanisms that are at play.
Yeah, I mean, we can go through, can't we? So the biggest site of disposal for glucose is your muscle.
Yeah.
So what happens under normal physiological functions is that if you eat a meal, insulin is released via the beta cells in the pancreas, and then that stimulates the uptake within muscle, and then ideally convert it to glycogen if it's not required. and it's just basically used as a reservoir. But if you become insulin resistant, that ability to store glycogen and synthesize it is impaired.
Yeah.
Because of the inability of glucose to get into the cell.
Yeah. And then, like you were saying, obviously it stops gluconeogenesis, which is the formation of new glucose from the liver. If insulin resistance is at play, the liver doesn't recognize the insulin, and so the liver then continues to produce glucose, and so then you get raised blood sugars, from that pathway as well.
Yeah. There's a few things that I wanted to go over, is that insulin resistance occurs in a lot of people before they've even got diabetes.
Yeah.
So if you go for a general health screen in the UK, US even, and you go for a HbA1c, even a fasting plasma glucose, you can miss insulin resistance in a lot of people, because basically your body will hypersecrete insulin to keep glucose at a normal level. So there's a few studies we've looked into. Have you looked into that one, where they get basically insulin resistant people and insulin sensitive people?
Yeah.
They give them the same amount of glucose.
Yeah.
And then their glucose over time, for these people anyway, before it's fully blown insulin resistance, they have basically the same plasma glucose. But when they look at the insulin levels, the insulin resistant group, or more insulin resistant, is nearly
high.
double.
Yeah.
And that's the body compensating. And that's what they say, about 10 to 15 years before type 2 diabetes, this hyperinsulinemia is happening for a long period of time. So it goes unmissed.
It does, and I think
it goes missed.
It goes missed. Since like for a couple of weeks now, I've had a lot of patients who come in with who do have a degree of insulin resistance, and I have become more acutely aware of it now, and so I usually will now tell patients, even if the HbA1c, I think I had a patient actually whose HbA1c was about 35, so well within the normal range, but the blood pressure was high. They had the BMI was about 32, the triglycerides were slightly raised, and like we were discussing last week with the triglyceride podcast, we know that can be a predictor of insulin resistance, especially if it's low, it's high compared to HDL cholesterol levels. But yet that patient probably had a bit of insulin resistance, and whereas, like you say, usually we would not do anything with that patient, because the HbA1c is fine, which is the marker that we tend to use, especially in the NHS, to act upon, especially so.
Yeah, I mean, we're intervening too late, 10 years too late in a lot of these instances. You've got, how would you assess it before you become diabetic? There's an oral glucose tolerance test.
That's probably the best way to do it, like without being so invasive.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
So what happens is you get your blood test done fasting at 0.0. You have, give or take, varying concentrations of glucose, but normally 75 grams.
Yeah.
I've done it when I was 9 or 10. It's absolutely disgusting, I'm not going to lie. But you have the drink after your blood test, and then every 30 minutes you get your blood sugars measured along with insulin levels, and then you can plot it against the graph, basically. So that's one way of looking at it. Like you said, the other way is triglycerides and HDL.
Yeah.
They're all like little insights into what's actually happening.
Again, you can't, we did say this last week as well, like you shouldn't use it in isolation. It should be looking at other things like HbA1c, high sensitivity CRP. Again, if you can do the oral glucose tolerance test, then that would be, the gold standard and the best way to do it. But again, it's about recognizing, what are the risk factors for having insulin resistance. So maybe we should go into that. So I would say obesity is one of them, especially if it's centrally, like if you carry your fat in like your abdomen. Genetic, I think, again, there is a genetic component to diabetes. And then I would say maybe looking at people's lifestyle. So if your diet is probably less high in sort of whole foods and things, you may be at an increased risk.
If it's got more refined sugars.
Yeah.
If you're more sedentary.
Yes.
These are all low muscle mass,
which
has obviously been combated by the obesity anyway.
Mm.
But do you want to go through how it manifests in terms of what's the mechanism? And we'll like simplify it as much as we can and try and go through it in our own heads.
Okay. Yes.
Do you want to go?
Okay, so is this
In terms of insulin resistance at the muscle, why
okay?
does it all happen?
Yeah, so basically what happens is that when you eat a meal, like you said before, your glucose level will rise, and so your pancreas will secrete insulin. Now on your muscle cell or on any cell, there is an insulin receptor. So insulin will bind to this receptor, and then a cascade happens within the cell, where basically what we want to happen is we want to get a GLUT4 receptor, which is a receptor that will bring in glucose. We want to get that to the cell membrane, and so this cascade of sort of events has to occur in order for this to translocate to the membrane for glucose to be brought into the cell. Somewhere along the way, there is a mechanism that will go wrong, and I think that you can explain this probably better than me, but it's to do with fat accumulation in the muscle cell, which is if we're thinking about, like we said, the person who might be at an increased risk of insulin sensitivity, they're usually sedentary, overweight, and eating foods that are going to increase the amount of fats that that are in the body. So this fat cell basically produces, I think, is it a diacylglycerol? Have I said that correct?
So that's the thing that does cause all the havoc, or they believe it to be anyway.
Yeah, and then it causes the havoc, and then it causes the GLUT4 receptor to not translocate, and so glucose cannot come into the cell. Was that a good way of explaining it?
So let's go through all the little intermediary bits.
Okay.
Just so people have got a full picture. We don't have to go into the full pathophysiological picture. But when the insulin binds to the receptor, what happens?
It sets off a cascade of
So
events.
it sets off the cascade, doesn't it? So what happens is when it binds, it
phosphorylates
itself, autophosphorylates. In medicinal chemistry, that just basically means activation of some form of cascade or molecule. It then stimulates these IRSs, which is insulin receptor substrate 1, which then are like little second messenger systems, and they go off to do other things. And one of them eventually is increasing this PI3 kinase, which then stimulates the GLUT4 transporter to go to the membrane, which then allows glucose to come in. We don't need to do anything to the glucose because it's against the concentration gradient. There's more glucose outside the cell. But what they found in studies was there was a lack of glucose and a lack of glucose 6-phosphate. All these chemicals within the cell.
Yeah, so they knew that it had to be something that was going on
have an issue coming into the cell. It wasn't anything to do with synthesizing glycogen per se in terms of enzymes. So when the fats, so diacylglycerols, are different to triglycerides, well, very similar. They've got the same backbone, so glycerol, but instead of having 3 fatty acids, they've got 2. And that extra space is occupied by
a hydroxyl group, which is very reactive.
Yeah.
So it causes havoc.
It just basically causes havoc, and then it basically down-regulates this PI3 kinase, which is one of the last steps to making GLUT4 go to the membrane. So what's the issue with not having glucose come into the cell?
So then you'll just have more glucose outside of the cell, so in the plasma, leading to hyperglycemia, which again is another complication, another presenting complaint of someone who has got insulin resistance.
So then we can't store glycogen as well. And then the liver's a bit different. So the liver has a basal sensitivity. So
the liver, from what I remember, doesn't need insulin in order for glucose to actually get into the liver, because it uses GLUT2 transporters.
Well, from what I've read, what I know.
So glucose can readily come into it, but I think that the insulin is needed in order to stop gluconeogenesis, which obviously if you are insulin resistant, then that doesn't occur, and so then that mechanism also leads to hyperglycemia.
Yeah, and that's backed up by the studies. So they showed muscle glycogen synthesis versus hepatic, so liver glycogen synthesis in these insulin resistance in comparison to a healthy individual. And the liver didn't really exhibit much difference, whereas in the muscle there was a 50% reduction. So that's what sparked all the investigations into all these things. But one thing that does happen within the liver that is different is de novo lipogenesis, meaning the formation of new fats. And then that's where it's the central link to a lot of these diseases, because if you've got too much fat within the liver, you'll get more exported in the form of ApoB. Then, go on.
No, so I was going to say, that obviously the reason for the fact that the liver is producing more fat is because we can't use glucose for energy. So the liver's thinking, well, what else are we going to use? Because we obviously need energy to survive, and so they'll produce more lipids to basically hope that that's going to be used for energy. But then we know that also insulin is involved in actually allowing fats to get into a cell as well. So then you've got more fat accumulation in the actual plasma, which then increases ApoB.
But the issue is that there's too much fat being made within the liver. You can get non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which can go to steatohepatitis, go to cirrhosis, all these things, and then you've got all the other complications down the line.
Yeah, I think I was reading that 80 million people in the US have got non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is huge. And then I think it was saying that it's going to be the leading cause of liver transplant.
Yeah,
probably very soon. Again, it's such a huge issue, and I think it's a lot to do with the change in environment, with us being more sedentary, like you say, and then also the change in the food environment where we're eating much more ultra processed foods, refined sugars, refined carbs. It's just increasing insulin resistance, and then leading to all these different complications.
It is. It's scary how effective or ineffective it can be on your lifestyle.
I was going to say, like, if we can understand insulin and how it works on every system within the body, I think you've really cracked, trying to prevent long-term health conditions, and metabolic syndrome is sort of the umbrella term for it, isn't it?
There is. I mean, there is a criteria. Did you look into that?
Of what metabolic syndrome was? I
Yeah.
did, yeah, vaguely. So it was adiposity.
Go on.
I think it was triglycerides were in there, so your triglycerides had to be above a certain level. They did use the American.
I think it's the 150 milligrams, isn't it? So 1.7 millimoles in the UK. I think.
Yeah, it was a high blood pressure.
Yeah, I think there was blood pressure, triglycerides.
Non-HDL or HDL? HDL was it? Yeah, HDL. I'd have to have a
There is a criteria of 5.
Yeah.
They reckon if you have 3 or more, your classes have a metabolic syndrome, and 90% of...
Oh, yeah.
Was it?
No, I think it was, yeah.
Yeah, and then 90% of US adults have at least one of the criteria, which is quite bad.
Yeah, it is. It is.
And I'm smiling. I don't know why, but yeah, insulin resistance is central to a lot of conditions that we are going to be discussing. There's a big link between the cardiovascular ApoB system. There's a big link between hepatic dysfunction.
Yeah.
And it is easy to actually modify a lot of the insulin resistance that we are seeing. And a big key take home is, go and have a look at the pathophysiology on your own. It is really complex.
Yeah.
And especially to remember the cascade in your head, it is a bit harder than what we thought. But it's this idea that you can reverse it.
You can.
And
I think what I wanted to say as well, though, is that if you end up getting it, it's harder to reverse it than it would be to prevent it. Because obviously once you then get insulin resistance, it just makes life a lot more difficult to be able to utilise the fat that you have got stored, because your insulin isn't working as effectively, and so.
Yeah, and a lot of people that you won't suspect of having it probably do have it. And the one point I do want to make is that a lot of the studies that have been done are on lean, young, adult males. Sedentary, because they wanted to remove obesity and exercise as confounding factors.
Yeah.
But the point is, they are young, lean, and it's still showing that they've got insulin resistance.
Yeah. I think we said this a little bit before. Again, it can be to do with genetics, that because of where fat does accumulate in one person versus the next. So like we said earlier on in the podcast, that this insulin resistance is a mechanism, is that there's buildup of fat in the muscle. So if you have a person who is more likely genetically to carry fat in the muscle, then they may be at an increased risk of insulin resistance. So you never know. I mean, a perfect example was, I think I had a patient this week who was BMI was fine, but they did have a HbA1c of about 48, which is just in the diabetic range. And so it's really not, it's not your typical presentation of type 2 diabetes. However, could they have been carrying more fat around around the organs, so more visceral fat, which increases the risk of developing it? You don't know unless you did like a DEXA scan or something to tell.
Well, yeah, I mean, type 2 diabetes develops from this idea that if you're secreting all this insulin and it's not having the effect, you can basically make the beta cells exhausted in effect. And then if you've got more fat coming from the liver, that'll deposit within the pancreas, and then it changes the structure of the beta cell, de-differentiates it, and then you're not producing enough of it, and then whatever you are producing is resistant. But I think it's just overused, the term, and I don't think a lot of people understand the complexity of, or severity of what it means, how it comes about, and how to reverse it. And there are 5 ways of which you can potentially reverse it, and we're going to do a podcast on hopefully each of them. Do you want to name the 5 top of your head?
So it's going to be diet, it's going to be exercise, it's going to be sleep, stress management.
And what do we practice in?
Medication.
Yeah. The one that we leave to the last is the one that we should know first.
I know, yeah. Well, it's the one that we don't want people to get to unless they absolutely have to. And that's why we do these podcasts, because we want people to live healthy lives, by preventing disease rather than reacting to when they, do get a disease. But I think we have covered actually quite a bit. I didn't think we would cover that much. It might have been a bit confusing because it, like you say, it's really difficult to read all the literature, read all the physiology, and then try and put it into a way that is
without
understandable.
Notes as well.
Yeah, but we hope that you have sort of taken something from it. If you have, and you do feel like somebody you know may also take something from it, then please send them this episode. But yeah, as this podcast, I think, I don't really have anything else to say. Do you have anything that you want to finish on?
I'm happy with what we've went through.
No, but so as always, thanks for watching, thanks for listening on whatever platform you are on. If you haven't already, then please like and subscribe to the channel, as it really helps us, and we will catch you at the next one.